Today, I am very pleased to introduce this exceptional sample course, How to Prevent Violence, Sociological, Psychological, and Spiritual Perspectives. It is being offered through the Preventing Violence Now Institute, which will soon be launching its public education program early next year. So two of my esteemed colleagues are joining us today. My colleagues, collaborators, and co-founders, Dr. James Gilligan and Dr. James Vredos. They will be leading today's discussion. And for those of you who are new, I am Dr. Bandy Lee, forensic and social psychiatrist who is now trying to alert about the urgent need of a life-affirming world order. Now, the subject my colleagues will explore is arguably the most urgent and consequential in all of human history. We now face the greatest existential threat to humankind, which is not disease or natural disaster, but our own violence. With technologies of mass destruction advancing rapidly, while our understanding of the psychological and sociological sources of violence lags behind, we now risk becoming the first species on the planet to bring about its own extinction. There could be no undertaking more vital to our evolutionary task of survival than halting this suicidal trajectory. Doing so requires more than suppressing violent acts after they occur. It demands a profound understanding of the psychological, social, and moral forces that give rise to violence in the first place. Only by confronting these root causes can we begin to dismantle the recurring patterns that are driving humanity to annihilation. Such a transformation cannot be achieved by institutions or policies alone, essential as they are, but must arise from the imagination and moral courage of creative thinkers, ethical leaders, and ordinary people. By cultivating radical love and a broader vision for shared humanity, we can move beyond fear and domination toward forms of relationship and governance that unlock humanity's higher potential. So we are eager to hear from our eminent scholars of violence, Dr. James Gilligan, and then Dr. James Vredos. Their illustrious careers are too long to enumerate here, and therefore I will refer you to my newsletter for a fuller introduction. But for now, briefly, Dr. James Gilligan has led some of the most influential prison and violence prevention transformations of our time. He first directed the court-mandated reform of the Massachusetts prison system following an epidemic of violence, establishing a Harvard University-led prison mental health service that succeeded in eliminating riots and hostage-taking and reducing homicides, suicides, and even post-release reimprisonment to zero for extended lengths of time. He later played a central role in shaping Boston's multidisciplinary strategy that brought youth homicides down to zero for 2.5 years, an achievement dubbed the Boston Miracle, and emulated across the country. Dr. Gilligan then helped design San Francisco's groundbreaking, intensive jail-based Resolve to Stop the Violence project, or RSVP, which achieved zero in-house violence and an 83% reduction in violent recidivism in the first year, ultimately becoming the nation's leading alternative to solitary confinement. His 2013 Board of Corrections Commission study found New York City's Rikers Island in severe violation, catalyzing major reform efforts, including calls for the facility's closure, borough-based jails, ending juvenile detention, and eliminating prolonged solitary confinement. His expertise has been sought at the highest levels of national and international governance. He served as chair of the committee for President Bill Clinton's highly successful national campaign against youth violence, as advisor for the House of Lords and to Prime Minister Tony Blair, and as consultant to the World Health Organization's new Department of Injuries and Violence Prevention. He also served as expert for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, as advisor to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, in drafting a critical report on violence against children, as member of a committee on negotiations and conflict resolution of the World Economic Forum, and as consultant on prison and prison mental health systems in New Zealand, Singapore, Japan, and Denmark, and counselor to the President and Justice Minister of Poland on how to control violence in maximum security prisons. So I will now turn it over to you, Dr. Gilligan.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Let me begin by partially recapitulating what you just mentioned, which is the existential importance of the problem of violence, and particularly at this point in our in world history. We know that from the students of evolution that 99% of the species that have ever existed have become extinct. And there is no law of God or man that exempts the human species from that risk ratio. What I'd say is that the risk of our becoming the first species in all of evolutionary history to render ourselves extinct by means of our own violence toward ourselves, toward other members of our own species, which ultimately involves us, is greater than, that risk is greater than it has ever been in evolutionary history, because we have invented thermonuclear weapons that are capable of destroying all life on Earth, and in any case, clearly all human life. So I can't, it would be impossible, I think, to overestimate or stress the importance of understanding the causes and prevention of human violence, particularly at this unprecedented point in our history as a species. Now, as Dr. Lee mentioned, I've spent more than 50 years, actually I go back to 1967, so it'll be 58 years, studying the causes and prevention of violence. I began by using prisons and jails, and eventually a whole city, the city of Boston, as my, you might say, social psychological laboratories in which to learn about the causes and prevention of violence as a problem in public health and preventive medicine, in the same way that microbiology laboratories do their research on trying to prevent and learn how to prevent and what causes other causes of death. Now, what I have found from that experience, I've then tried to apply to violence as it occurs outside prisons. In other words, I began my work in prisons of Massachusetts back in 1967, and more intensively in 1977, as a way of beginning to find out from the people who've committed violence what led them to do that. In other words, if you're trying to study an infectious disease, tuberculosis or syphilis or whatever, you have to look, you have to find the patients. That's where the problem is. Or with COVID-19 or AIDS or whatever in today's world. I went into the prisons for the same reason that Willie Sutton, the bank robber, said he went into banks because that's where the money was. I went into prisons because that's where the violence is. In other words, the most violent people in our society, in terms of behavioral violence, like homicide and suicide, are the people in our prisons. My thought was that it was only by studying those people and learning from them that we could learn what causes violence on whatever scale throughout the world. And I will emphasize that has always been my goal from the beginning, to understand violence as an aspect of human nature that could threaten and does threaten all of us. Now, one of the first things I discovered when I began working with people in prisons was when I would ask somebody why he had killed or assaulted or even raped another person, I would almost always get the same answer, that he would say, because he or she disrespected me. They said that so often that they abbreviated it into the slang word, instead of disrespected, dissed. He dissed me or she dissed me. And it struck me that whenever somebody uses a word so often that they abbreviate it, it says something about how central it is in their moral and emotional vocabulary. What I came to realize as I studied these men, and I would love to tell you individual case histories and individual stories. I can tell you 1,000 of them because I've seen certainly more than 1,000 murderers over the last 50 years. But I will spend a limited amount of time. And today I just want to give you an outline of what we can talk about and how we would expand it. Now, what I would say that what I learned from my observational work in the prisons, working with individual murderers, serial murderers, mass murderers, and people who have committed all kinds of other crimes, including attempted murder. And I emphasize lethal violence there because that is the most important and ineradicable. I mean, you can't reverse a murder. People can sometimes recover from less serious forms of violence, at least to some degree. Probably never completely, but to some degree. But once somebody has committed or been a victim of murder or suicide, for that matter, you cannot do anything further. They're dead forever. So I've emphasized the study of lethal violence because I think that is what is most threatened, has always threatened us in throughout history, but now more than ever to an unprecedented degree. Now, what I found was, the way to summarize it, and again, I'm going to give you kind of some, I mean, sound like abstractions, but believe me, they are based on intensive work with individuals. What I would say is that there are two emotions that are at the basis, or I'd say are the, I would call them emotive forces that are the motive forces, that is the causes or psychological causes of violent behavior. And those are shame and guilt. Now, what I would say about shame and guilt as emotions is that, and I would break it down and mention the shame as the opposite of pride. That is, there's a continuum from shame to pride, and guilt is the opposite of innocence. There is a continuum from the feeling of guilt to the feeling of innocence. Now, what I would want to mention is that those emotions are as central to all human behavior as love and hate are. And I emphasize love and hate because those are basically the causes of all human behavior. When we pursue something and want to expand our access to it or keep it alive and present, we do that because we love that thing or that person. When we want to exterminate or destroy something, get it out of our lives, that's because we hate that thing or person. So love and hate are the master causes and emotions of all human behavior. How are shame and guilt related? Shame and guilt are love and hate, except as directed toward the self. And what they do is shame is the absence of or deficiency of self-love. Remember, the opposite of shame is pride. Pride is self-love, self-esteem, feelings of self-worth, and so forth. Shame is the deficiency of self-love. It is the response when people feel humiliated, insulted, disrespected, defeated, rejected, punished, treated as less worthy than other people. So there are many synonyms for shame and guilt. And it's important to recognize there's not just one word that people use to describe it. Now, what's important here in terms of understanding violence is that shame and guilt are the determinants of human violence. The primary motive cause of violence, and I'd say this is a necessary cause, but it's not alone sufficient. It needs also social and biological components as well. But the necessary psychological cause of all human violence ultimately is the feeling of shame, meaning the absence or deficiency of self-love, and the desire to replace shame with pride by humiliating other people in the way is the ultimate humiliation, which is to injure them or kill them, by which you show that you are more powerful than they are, you are not weak, you are not inadequate, you have so much power that that you can wipe out their ability to shame you. What shame motivates is anger toward other people and love toward the self. It motivates love toward the self, meaning like being egocentric, self-centered, selfish, grandiose, and so forth, or megalomania, belief that you're the greatest person on earth and so forth. Shame, when people feel ashamed, they are motivated to try to get as much love for themselves as they can, and to hate other people as the way of shaming other people and transferring their own shame onto the victims of their violence. Guilt is the opposite of shame. Guilt motivates love toward others and hatred toward the self. That is, when people feel guilty, they feel like they deserve punishment, they deserve pain, and they can reduce the feeling of pain, of guilt rather. And guilt is one of the, like shame, is these are among the two most painful emotions people can have. One way to reduce the amount of guilt people feel is by punishing themselves and by being good to other people. My point is that neither shame nor guilt solves the problem of violence. Shame merely directs violence toward other people. Guilt merely directs it toward the self. What we need is what I would call a third emotion, which is beyond shame and guilt, and that is the emotion of love towards self and others. This is the emotion that first of all, the natural component of human nature. I'm not talking about, people having to become saints to be able to love themselves and others. I'm saying that is an essential component of human nature. We are born with the capacity to love, the desire to love, and so forth. When a newborn baby is born, the baby is born with an inbuilt, innate drive to bond with the mother, to form an attachment with the mother, and that's what's called guilt. That's why Aristotle was correct 2,500 years ago when he said that human beings are social animals. Incidentally, the Greek language he used also meant we are political animals, but social and political are just two synonyms for the same ultimate reality. So what shame and guilt do is they not only motivate behavior, which is action, and they themselves are emotions, But there's a third function of human nature, in addition to emotion and action, and that is cognition. That is, shame and guilt motivate different cognitive structures, which in the realm of what Kant called practical reason, are called moral value systems. Moral value systems exist to tell us how we should act or how we should behave. Shame motivates what I call shame ethics. Guilt motivates what I call guilt ethics. In shame ethics, the highest good is pride, and the worst evil is shame and humiliation. Uh, Guilt ethics is the opposite. In guilt ethics, pride is not the highest good, it is the worst evil. In the guilt ethic of the Judeo-Christian tradition, pride became the deadliest of the seven deadly sins. In other words, pride is the most deadly thing. And humility, which to the shame-driven personality or moral value system is the worst evil, humility is the highest good. St. Augustine put it at the head of all of the virtues. So what I'm saying is shame and guilt are often used by people in ordinary language as if they were more or less synonyms of each other. What I'm saying is they are, in fact, opposites and antagonistic toward each other. Whatever increases shame decreases guilt. That's why being humble, being self-humiliated, having humility, it increases shame but decreases guilt. And whatever increases guilt decreases shame. That's one reason why shame motivates violence. The more guilty you are, the more virtuous you are in terms of a shame ethic. Now, I emphasize that because people often think of criminals who commit the kinds of violence that we call murder, uh, are people who never developed a moral value system, or they are amoral or immoral. I'm saying that is a huge mistake. What we need to understand is people who commit violence toward other people are motivated by a moral value system called shame ethics, which says you should kill other people. In other words, what I'm saying is there's not just one morality in the world. There are two moral value systems, and they are exact opposites of each other. And they've been with us throughout the time we've been thinking in terms of moral value systems. When I first started working in the prisons, I shared that ignorance. I thought the people in the prisons were those who were just had never developed morality. What I discovered to my surprise was I had never met people who were more constantly preoccupied with moral issues and morality and moral values than the people who'd committed the worst crimes and violence and homicides and rapes you can imagine. But what they felt was that what they were doing was required. It was innocent. They did not have any feelings of guilt about the harm they'd done to other people. What they would talk about is that they would focus on moral issues, talk about that more than almost any other subject. What they would be preoccupied with is issues of justice and injustice, but in which they saw themselves as the victims of injustice and their victims as the perpetrators of injustice toward them. Their victims sometimes just being scapegoats for other people who had humiliated them or shamed them. So what now Nietzsche, there are many philosophers who've talked about the two different forms of morality. I'll just quote one at the moment. That is Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, who distinguished between what he called master morality, which corresponds to what I'm calling shame ethics, and slave morality, which is what I'm calling guilt ethics. What he's saying is that master morality was the morality that told people they should become the masters of slaves. Slave morality is the morality that says you should accept being a slave and not trying to dominate other people. Be humble, forgive your enemies, love your enemies, resist not evil, and so forth. That's what a guilt ethic motivates. That's one reason why Freud commented quite correctly that nobody feels guiltier than the saints. They're people who are motivated to avoid guilt, or the theological term for guilt is sin, uh, and to wipe out their sin by means of self-punishment or letting other people punish them. What Freud did not notice or mention, because he never worked with violent patients, as far as am aware, um, is that no one feels more innocent than the criminals, the people who commit the violent crimes that we call them guilty for. But they don't have a capacity for feeling guilty. They are proud of the violence they've committed. They feel it was a way of rectifying the injustices that they feel themselves have suffered from. Okay, so that's a brief introduction. I'm sorry it's a very inadequate one to individual violence. I just want to quickly mention collective political violence, and then I will finish a lot of this talk. The difference between individual violence, like individual murders or homicides or suicides, is that they're aimed at one individual killing another or killing himself. Collective political violence differs in that from individual violence. In individual violence, people feel they have been shamed or humiliated by other individuals. And so they take out their anger on other individuals to try to undo their shame and humiliation by means of violence. When people commit collective violence, political violence, it's because they feel the group they belong to and which they identify with has been shamed and humiliated by another group. I'll give it just a few examples of our difference. And one way that one of the campaign promises that won Hitler to power in Nazi Germany was by pledging to undo the shame of Versailles, meaning the Versailles Peace Treaty, which he felt the terms of which had humiliated Germany and violated German national honor. And his solution for that was, of course, almost unlimited violence towards scapegoats, such as the Jews, the Romani people, and so forth, but to the largest scale toward the Jews. When let me just give one other example. When Osama bin Laden made his first public comments after the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York on 9/11, 2001, he explained why they'd done that. He said those attacks were payback for what he called 80 years of humiliation and contempt that he said the entire Western world, which the United States symbolized, had inflicted on the whole Islamic nation. So in case of both Hitler and Osama bin Laden, and I could give you a dozen other examples, people who've committed collective political violence or instigated it have been done to wipe out a collective shame, a feeling of collective dishonor. You can see the same thing in why Putin is attacking Ukraine today, or why Trump is attacking all kinds of people around the world. Well, we don't know yet what he'll do, so let's say that's a potential. But what I'm saying is when people are motivated by shame and are oriented towards self-aggrandizement, it doesn't necessarily just take an individual level. It can go on to a collective or political, national, or geopolitical scale. And I'd say throughout human history, shame is what has motivated wars and genocides, just as on an individual level, shame is the primary motive of homicide and suicide. Let me just add one last thing, and then I will stop. One difference between shame and guilt is shame primarily motivates homicide, that is violence toward other people, whereas guilt primarily motivates suicide, which is violence toward the self. These are both forms of lethal violence. They kill the person involved. But the direction of the violence, the victim who's chosen, is the opposite in these. Shame directs violence outwards, guilt directs it inwards. Neither of them solves the problem of violence. That can only come about when people develop the capacity for love of self and others, a capacity for which the biblical term in Greek was agape. It's the Latin term is caritas, the root of our word charity. But it means the capacity to love others as oneself and as oneself. One thing I found among the violent prisoners I worked with as individuals was when they first came into the prison for the violent crime they'd committed, they felt totally innocent. They had no feelings of guilt for what they had done because they felt it was justified, morally justified in terms of the shame ethic that was their moral value system. After they had been in our program for a year or two and had been treated with respect, had been given opportunities for therapy and education, they began to realize how much pain they had caused other people. And they began to develop the capacity to feel guilty for what they had done to other people. At that point, they would become suicidal and sometimes make serious suicide attempts. And we'd have to struggle with that problem for the next couple of years. Finally, to my surprise, they did something I had not expected, but there it was. I observed it. They discovered that they could be of help to other people. If they were literate, they could help the illiterate learn how to read and write. And actually, about 40% of prison inmates are illiterate. Those who are illiterate could help others to read and write, or help them write letters home, or help them deal with the law library in the prison, or simply help by improving the quality of food in the kitchens and so forth. But they learned that by helping other people, they would feel neither shame nor guilt, because showing that they had the capacity to help others was something they could take pride in. It showed they had abilities, competencies, and more than they needed just for themselves. And they certainly would not feel guilty because they were helping other people, not harming them. So what I'm saying is these are universal possibilities in human nature. They're built in. They don't require people to become saints. What we need to do is find out what is inhibiting us, inhibiting anybody from, I'd say, from reaching what is a normal component of human nature that we are born with, and that is the capacity to love others and to love ourselves and to find alternatives to violence, so that when we're aggressive, it'll be toward whatever is killing us, bacteria, viruses, or whatever, but not other people or ourselves. Okay, let me stop there. That's a brief, inadequate introduction, but I just want to give you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about.
Wonderful, Dr. Gilligan. Beautifully said. Thank you for your wise words. Now we are greatly privileged to be hearing from Dr. James Reddowes, whose distinguished career began at Columbia University School of Social Work in 1968. There he studied deviance, social movements, and social change under the renowned sociologist Richard Cloward, who remained his mentor and intellectual companion until 2001. Cloward's profound influence helped shape Dr. Reddowes' lifelong inquiry into deviance, violence, and justice, an inquiry richly expressed through his numerous contributions to Tikkun magazine, including incisive critiques of fear-based crime policies, analyses of stop and frisk policing, and visionary explorations of transformative justice. His scholarly work has also appeared in Law Enforcement News, Dialectical Anthropology, and Violent States and Creative States, Human Violence and Creative Humanity. Dr. Vredos taught sociology, criminology, and criminal justice for more than 2 decades at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and for 10 years at Yeshiva University, where he developed their criminal justice curriculum and guided generations of students through internship programs. He is co-author of the widely respected text, The Elementary Forms of Statistical Reason, and served for over a decade as facilitator of New York City's Tikkun group of spiritual progressives. A committed activist as well as a scholar, Dr. Vredos helped organize the first major civil disobedience action against New York City's stop and frisk practices in 2011 and played a critical role in the subsequent trial challenging those policies. His public engagement extends to influential media platforms, including the Rebbe, the Radical, and the Rev on Progressive Radio, and the long-running cable program, The Radical Imagination, on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Deeply involved in Reverend William Barber's new Poor People's Campaign, he has organized numerous conferences and public events dedicated to transformative justice, economic equity, and progressive social change. Dr. Vredos.
Thank you so very, very much, Dr. Lee and Dr. Gilligan, and all of you who are here. It is really an honor and a blessing. And I just wanted to start us off by, you mentioned the show I used to host, the Rebbe, the Radical, and the Rev. Just in case some of you are curious, which you may or may not be, I was not the Rebbe and I was not the Rev. So actually those roles were Michael Lerner was our rabbi, and Stephen Phelps, Riverside Church, was our reverend who did the show with us. So again, it's just wonderful to be here and to follow Dr. Gilligan, which I have to say, again, there's so many things that my work as a sociologist in criminal justice has overlapped what Dr. Gilligan has just told us and discussed. But again, as you obviously realize, my approach, sociological approach, starts quite differently in a sense. But ironically, the first major modern scientific work in sociology was by Emil Durkheim in 1898 and was entitled Suicide. And these social thinkers like Marx and Tocqueville and Weber and Durkheim, Saint-Simon, and others, these 19th and early 20th century thinkers, especially Durkheim, of course, were interested in establishing a field that was separate and distinct. And Durkheim's work really lays the foundation. It by far is the most influential work and paradigm that is developed that has dominated American sociology and criminal justice up until this present day. So I'd like to start with a brief overview of Durkheim's work, in which he, again, as I say, was very, his major emphasis was to establish the field. But I also want to emphasize that it was in response to various public health authorities, politicians who became very concerned about the rising rate of suicide in France at that time. So sociology from its very beginning, in a sense, had certainly scholarly, but also activist roots. Now, Durkheim looked at also the large-scale economic, cultural, social transformations that Europe was going through, the breakdown of the old order, the developments of democracy across the continent, the rise of industrialization, and above all else, the effects that capitalism was having on human beings, their psyche, their perception of themselves, and so on. He certainly understood that, but he did not carry it forward that much in his work on certainly on suicide. So he was more interested in establishing a discipline that was empirical, that was logical, that was rational, right? He looked at the data, the empirical data, and became curious about why these rates of suicide, and he called it the rates of suicide. So sociologists talk a lot about rates of, divorce or crime rates. We get that from Durkheim. So he was curious as to what caused rates of suicide to go up and down. And he felt if he could understand that, we could do something about it and come up with policies that would make a difference. And again, as I said, he took a topic that most people think of as pretty much exclusively an individual phenomenon, and yet showed that it was large-scale social forces external to the individual that were central in forming that individual. He called these forms, if you will, social facts. These are things external to the individual that impact on the individual. This is his wording, that restrain and constrain us. And the most prevalent suicide of his day, he understood to be anomic suicide. That was the term he used. There was altruistic suicide, in which the person gave himself up to the cause, for the movement, for the revolution, and so on. Then there was egoistic suicide, in which the person was, in a sense, under-socialized. There was a lack of socialization, a lack of social connection. But Durkheim was fixated on this idea of anomie, which briefly can be explained as a social situation that people were experiencing. They were once well established, right, in their lives, their lifestyles, their communities, and so on. Something comes along to disrupt that sense of unity, of belonging, that is a very painful experience for people to go through. So this also is a model. Remember, again, the social sciences were attempting to emulate the physical sciences, right? The physical sciences were concerned with finding the ultimate laws of the physical universe. Sociologists attempted to find or try to discover the social laws of the social universe. So there was a certain idea that, well, if we could find these laws, there was a certain determinacy about it. We just needed to find the law that was governing social behavior in the same way that the physical scientists, the physicists, and biologists, and the chemists were uncovering the natural laws of the natural universe. Big problem there. Human behavior is very complex, and it's incredibly difficult to narrow it down to one overriding deterministic variable. Marx, of course, tried to do that with his economic perspective, economic determinism. There's an interesting book, 1916, by the Dutch criminologist Wilhelm Bonger, Criminality and Economic Conditions. And everything about criminality, criminal justice, and so on, was rooted in a capitalistic economic system that impinged on people, restrained people, structured them in various ways. But getting back to Durkheim, Anomie was, in fact, a very painful emotion and feeling to experience. He followed in the footsteps of the natural scientists by making it a hydraulic paradigm or model. That is, the more stress, the more anomie someone was experiencing, the more likelihood, probability of them committing suicide. So as one goes up, the other goes up. And that stress variable was all important, or weakened social control was all important in explaining the nature of deviance, criminality, and so on. Now, his recommendation was to make French life among the communities that were experiencing these rising rates of suicide to come up with policies that would make people more harmoniously connected to their communities again, education, jobs, and so on. Something very practical. Now, let me skip somewhat abruptly to 1939, where the concept of anomie gets picked up by probably the most famous American sociologist of the 20th century, Robert Merton, taught at Columbia. And his work was entitled Social Structure and Anomie. And he picked up on Durkheim's term. But he changed it. He said that the problem wasn't so much the disharmony that people were experiencing, the rootlessness, the normlessness, to use the sociological jargon, but the insatiability of the American political structure. And he had a means goals typology that he used, that the ends of American society, basically money, materialism, and it created this insatiability. It was never enough. I mean, I don't think we need to look around us and look at the would-be multi-billionaires who would-be multi-trillionaires and da 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 da. So the insatiability that's built in the social structure, right? That's a given. Capitalism on steroids, whatever you want to call it, predatory capitalism, and so on. At the very same time, Merton argued, the means to distribute the goals was not equally distributed. Okay? And that was what explained for Merton the rise of crime and violence in certain groups of people whose ability to move up the ladder to try to achieve the material goods that so much pressure was placed on all of us created a certain sense of anomie that manifests itself in particular groups or communities that had been deprived or not really allowed for a variety of reasons to participate in that American dream. Okay, very, very important perspective, very influential. Skipping to Richard Cloward's work, Cloward did his work under Merton and added a very, very significant extension, in a sense, to that work in his own work entitled The Theory of Illegitimate Opportunities. Cloward argued this, that it wasn't one overall variable that explained. In fact, Merton was wrong in trying to explain all forms of social deviance by this one variable of anomie, right? He called it the innovative category. That was where most crime was committed. He also had a category named called ritualist. And then there was the retreatists, those who had opted out of the dominant culture. And then there was the rebel, the revolutionary, and so on. So Cloward argued that you can't explain all forms of deviance by this one variable, anomie. How does one explain why some groups turn to crime versus revolution, for example, or internalize it, become more suicidal or more prone to suicide? So Cloward opened up this whole idea of illegitimate opportunities, an overabundance of illegitimate opportunities, a lack of legitimate opportunities. He followed in with other workers and other scholars of his day, the Tilley's resource mobilization theory, and so on. And through sort of happenstance, his work, which he also, as Dr. Gilligan was pointing out, his work was also very much rooted in prison. So was Cloward's. Cloward also did work on his perspective in prisons as well. But 1960, of course, was beginnings of the Kennedy years. And Robert Kennedy became very interested in this idea of illegitimate opportunities. They were very concerned with juvenile delinquency, the connection between that, and so on. And so they funded a program called Mobilization for Youth. Cloward was the research director for that, starting the Lower East Side, Manhattan. And again, so we're back to the sociologist as an activist. Durkheim wanted the sociologist to be a social expert, coming in there and applying these objective truths to reality out there. And Cloward followed in that tradition to a point. Soon after he became the research director, he decided that the program should have more of an emphasis not on preventing juvenile delinquency, gang violence as such, although that was part of it, but it became a concern with poverty. That was what was really behind the violence. And of course, we could talk about structural violence, the way in which a society, a culture creates the opportunities, and as Dr. Gilligan has pointed out, the need to divide and conquer us and to have scapegoats and so on and so on. So in a sense, Cloward began to politicize the term deviance, sociology of deviance, and tried to initiate a larger, more political discussion. And certainly the 60s was a time where that was occurring. Critical criminologists and labeling theorists like Howard Becker establishing the notion of master status, and Edwin Lemmert talking about primary, secondary deviation. Primary deviation being the initial rule-breaking activity versus secondary deviation, which is the consequences that people were experiencing as a result of the initial deviation, the primary deviation. So this opens up all kinds of possibilities. And along with, of course, the power of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement, people became more and more interested in connecting, as again, the work of Dr. Gilligan and Dr. Lee, the moral with the political, or as Cornel West puts it today, let suffering speak, as Dr. Gilligan pointed out. He listened to people who were suffering, their stories, their narratives. It wasn't a social expert coming in there with a preconceived notion that we knew best and we knew best for you. So the labeling theorists were very important. Cloward, during that decade, also entered in with his colleague and partner and later wife, Frances Fox Piven, and developed the welfare rights movement, welfare rights organization, which was a movement of welfare recipients, right, who would organize themselves and make demands on the system to break that system, in a sense, fiscally, so that those in power would be brought to bear and would have to, hopefully, the plan was to bring enough political pressure to the top that we would then have a guaranteed annual income. Of course, that did not work out, even though Nixon came up with a very, very modest proposal. But then you, of course, had counter movements to all of that and so on. But the struggle goes on. So I wanted to bring Cloward in as a figure, but one of the many figures in how sociology has evolved over the decades. And he's been certainly a very important one. There's many, many others. I just did a show on radical imagination with Tony Platt, who 50 years ago wrote a book called The Child Savers, in which he began to identify, this was back in 1969. And the irony was, when I was a grad student with Cloward, that was one of the books we read, the Child Savers. So these were mainly upper middle class professionals and women who thought they were doing good by coming up with various programs for orphaned and poor kids. And yet, in the name of doing good, another very famous book of its time by psychiatrist Willard Galen, in the name of doing good, more harm could and did occur. So that adds another problem to the whole role that sociologists and all of us need that we need to play, that we need to be aware of as we play out these roles. And let me finish off, because I know I'm sure there's a lot of hands going up, so there's a lot of questions. So let me just wrap it up by saying this. I've been very heartened. I know this is maybe a lot of people aren't, but I'm very heartened by the organizing that's going on in this country, the mobilization, especially with young people who are beginning to resist and stand up and come up with new ways of offering those alternative visions that Dr. Gilligan, Dr. Lee, and I have always advocated. Restorative justice, healing. How do we go about doing that? How do we go about bringing down? Well, one of the ways we begin to do that is to join up with people like Cornel West, Radical Love, right? Justice is what love looks like in public. Wow, think about that. Or Reverend Barber. So it's not about categories, it's not about labels. As he puts it, those words are too puny. Some things are just basically right, and some things are basically wrong. You don't come in and separate 4 or 5-year-old kids from their parents in brutal ways. We have come to that point of barbarity. So what we need, and let me close here, and this is what I think Dr. Gilligan was pointing out. Love, transformative love, an inclusive love can be the force that can overcome all of the greed, the immorality, if you will, the barbarity that is being perpetuated. And so that's what I think we need to begin to realize, that the social sciences can still be objective. Obviously, you don't make up data, but we need to take moral stands, and we need to ferret that out so people have a clear moral vision coupled with really social science that has integrity, that is speaking truth to power, and so on. All right, so I know there's so many questions, so let me stop there, and thank you again for giving me this opportunity.
Well, thank
to
you
talk.
so much, Dr. Bredos, for that illuminating talk.